I'm going to read some humor pieces by different authors in chronological order of their publication. First will be Robert C. Benchley, The Tortures of Weekend Visiting, published in Of All Things in 1921. Second, by A. Milne, The King's Breakfast and Rice Pudding, published in When We Were Very Young, 1924. Third, by James Thurber, The Night the Ghost Got In, from My Life and Hard Times, published 1933. And last, by Florence King, a magazine column on spinsterhood, published July 19, 1993. The Tortures of Weekend Visiting, by Robert Benchley. The present labor situation shows to what a pretty pass things may come because of a lack of understanding between the parties involved. I bring in the present labor situation just to give the thing timeliness. Had I been writing for the Christmas number, I should have begun as follows. The indiscriminate giving of Christmas presents shows to what a pretty pass things may come because of a lack of understanding between the parties involved. The idea to be driven home is that things may come to a pretty pass by the parties involved in an affair of any kind if they do not come to an understanding before commencing operations. I hope I have made my point clear. Especially is this true, watch out carefully now as the whole nub of the article will be coming along in just a minute. Especially is this true in the relations between host and guest on weekend visits. There, you have it. In fact, the title to this whole thing might very well be The Need for a Clearer Definition of Relations Between Host and Guest on Weekend Visits, and not be overstating it at that. The logic of this will be apparent to anyone who has ever been a host or a guest at a weekend party, a classification embracing practically all Caucasians over 11 years of age who can put powder on the nose or tie a bow tie. Who has not wished that his host would come out frankly at the beginning of the visit and state in no uncertain terms the rules and preferences of the household in matters such as the breakfast hour? And who has not sounded his guest to find out what he likes in the regulation of his diet and modus vivendi, mode of living? Collective bargaining on the part of labor unions and capital makes it possible for employers to know just what the workers think on matters of common interest. Is collective bargaining between host and guest so impossible, then? Take, for example, the matter of arising in the morning. Of course, when there is a large house party, the problem is a simple one, for you can always hear the others puttering about and brushing their teeth. You can regulate your own arising by the number of people who seem to be astir. But if you are the only guest, there is apt to be a frightful misunderstanding. At what time is breakfast, you ask? Oh, any old time on Sundays, replies the hostess with a generous smile. Sleep as late as you like, this is Liberty Hall. The sentiment in this attitude is perfectly bully, but there is nothing that you can really take hold of in it. It satisfies at the time, but in the morning there is a vagueness about it that is simply terrifying. Let us say that you awake at 8. You listen, and hear no one stirring. Then over on the cool pillow again until 8:20. Again up on the elbow, with head cocked on one side. There is a creak in the direction of the stairs. They may all be up and going down to breakfast. It is but the work of a moment to bound out of bed and listen at the door. Perhaps open it modestly and peer out. Death-like silence, broken only, as the phrase goes, by the ticking of the hall clock, and not a soul in sight. Probably they are late sleepers. Maybe 11 o'clock is their Sunday rising hour. Some people are like that. Shut the door and sit on the edge of the bed. More sleep is out of the question. Let's take a look at the pictures in the guest room, just to pass the time. Here's one of Lorna Doone. How to do, Lorna? Here's a group taken in 1902, showing your host in evening clothes, holding a mandolin, probably a member of his college musical club. Rather unkempt-looking bunch, you must say. Well, how about this one? An etching showing suspicious-looking barges on what is probably the Thames. Well, fair enough at that. But back to the door and listen. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Probably, if you started your tub, you'd wake the whole house. Let's sit down on the edge of the bed again. Hello, here are some books on the table. 50 Famous Sonnets, illustrated by Maxfield Parrish. Never touch a sonnet before breakfast. My Experiences in the Alps by a woman mountaineer who has written on the flyleaf, to my good friends, the Eldridges, in memory of many happy days together at Charmeau, October 1907. That settles that. Essay on Compensation in Limp Leather by R.W. Emerson, published by Houghton, Mifflin and Company. Oh, very well. You suppose they thought that would be over your head, did they? Well, we'll just show them. We'll just read it for spite. Opening to the red ribbon. Of the like nature is that expectation of change which instantly follows the suspension of our voluntary activity, the terror of cloudless noon. By the way, it must be nearly noon now. 10 minutes past 9 only. Well, the only thing to do is get dressed and go about and walk about the grounds. Eliminate the tub as too noisy. And so, very cautiously, almost clandestinely, you proceed to dress. And now, just reverse the process. Suppose you are the host. You have arisen at 8 and listened at the guest's door. No sound. Tiptoe back and get dressed, talking in whispers to your wife, the hostess, and cramming flannel bears into the infant's mouth to keep him from disturbing the sleeper. Bill looked tired last night. Better let him sleep a little longer, you suggest. And so downstairs on your hands and knees and look over the Sunday papers. Then a bracing walk on the porch, resulting in a terrific appetite. A glance at the watch shows 9 o'clock. Sunday breakfast is usually at 8:30. The warm aroma of coffee creeps in from the kitchen, and somewhere someone is baking muffins. This is awful. You suppose it feels something like this to be caught on an ice floe without any food and so starved to death. Only there you can't smell coffee and muffins. You sneak into the dining room and steal one of the property oranges from the sideboard, but little Edgar sees you and sets up such a howl that you have to give it to him. The hostess suggests that your friend may have the sleeping sickness. Weakened by hunger, you hotly resent this, and one word leads to another. Oh, very well, I'll go up and rout him out, you snarl. Upstairs again, and poise and listening attitude just in front of the guest's door. Slowly the door opens, inch by inch, and finally his head is edged cautiously out toward yours. Hello, Bill, you say flatly. What are you getting up this time of the morning for? Thought I told you to sleep late. Morning, Ed, he says, equally flatly. I hope I haven't kept you all waiting. Then you both lie and eat breakfast. Such a misunderstanding is apt to go to almost any length. I once knew of a man on a weekend visit who spent an entire Sunday in his room, listening at his door to see if the family were astir, while in the meantime the family were, one by one, tiptoeing to his door to see if they could detect any signs of life from him. Each thought the other needed rest. Along about 3 in the afternoon, the family threw all hospitality aside and ate breakfast, deadening the sound of the cutlery as much as possible, little dreaming that their guest was looking through the A Prayer for Each Day calendar for the 9th time and seriously considering letting himself down from the window on a sheet and making for the next train. Shortly after dark, persistent rumors got abroad that he had done away with himself, and everyone went up and sniffed for gas. It was only when the maid, who was not in on the secret, bolted into the room to turn down his bed for the night that she found him tiptoeing about, packing and unpacking his bag and listening eagerly at the wall. Now, don't ask how it happened that the maid didn't know that his bed hadn't been made that morning. What difference does that make, anyway? It is such questions as that blight any attempt at individual writing in this country. Don't think just because I have taken all this space to deal with the rising hour problem that there are no other points to be made. Oh, not at all. There is, for instance, the question of exercise. After dinner, the host says to himself, "Something must be done. I wonder if he likes to walk." Aloud he says, "Well, Bill, how about a little hike in the country?" A hike in the country being the last thing in the world that Bill wants, he says, "All righto, anything you say." And so, although walking is a tremendous trial to the host, who has weak ankles, he bundles up with a great show of heartiness and grabs his stick as if this were the one thing he lived for. After about a mile of hobbling along the countryside, the host says, hopefully, "Don't let me tire you out, old man. Any time you want to turn back, just say the word." The guest, thinking longingly of the fireside, scoffs at the idea of turning back, insisting that if there is one thing in all the world that he likes better than walking, it is running. So on they jog, hippity-hop, each wishing that it would rain so they could turn around and go home. Here again, the thing may go to almost tragic lengths. Suppose neither has the courage to suggest the return move. They might walk on into Canada, or they might become exhausted and have to be taken into a roadhouse and eat a $2 old-fashioned Southern dinner of fried chicken and waffles. The imagination revolts at a further contemplation of the possibilities of this lack of cooperation between guest and host. I once visited a man who had an outdoor swimming pool on his estate. Consider that as very casually said. It was in April, long before spring had really understood what was expected of her. My first night there, my host said, "Are you a morning plunger?" Thinking that he referred to a tub plunge in a warm bathroom, I glowed and said, "You bet." "Oh, call for you at 7 in the morning then," he said, "and we'll go out to the pool." It was evidently his custom, and I wasn't going to have it said of me that a middle-aged man could outdo me in virility. So at 7 in the morning, in the dense fog, with now and then a slash of cold rain, we picked our way out to the pool and staged a vivid Siberian moving picture scene, showing naked peasants bathing in the Nevsky. My visit lasted 5 days, and I afterward learned from one to whom my host had confided that it was the worst 5 days he had ever gone through, and that he has chromatic joint trouble as a result of those plunges. "But I couldn't be outdone by a mere stripling," he said, "and the boys certainly enjoyed it." All of this might have been avoided by the posting of a sign in a conspicuous place in my bedroom, reading as follows: "Personally, I dislike swimming in the pool at this time of the year. Guests wishing to do so may obtain towels at the desk." How very simple and practical. The sign system is the only solution I can offer. It is crude and brutal, but it admits of no misunderstanding. A sign in each guest room, giving the hours of meals, political and religious preferences of the family, general views on exercise, etc., etc., with a blank for the guest to fill out, stating his own views on these subjects, would make it possible to visit or entertain with a sense of security thus far unknown upon our planet. The King's Breakfast by A. Milne. The king asked the queen, and the queen asked the dairy maid, "Could we have some butter for the royal slice of bread?" The queen asked the dairymaid. The dairymaid said, "Certainly, I'll go and tell the cow now before she goes to bed." The dairymaid, she curtsied, and went and told the Alderney, "Don't forget the butter for the royal slice of bread." The Alderney said sleepily, "You'd better tell his Majesty that many people nowadays like marmalade instead." The dairymaid said, "Fancy," and went to her Majesty. She curtsied to the Queen, and she turned a little red. "Excuse me, your Majesty, for taking of the liberty, but marmalade is tasty if it's very thickly spread." The Queen said, "Oh," and went to his Majesty. "Talking of the butter for the royal slice of bread, many people think that marmalade is nicer. Would you like to try a little marmalade instead?" The King said, "Bother," and then he said, "Oh, dearie me." The King sobbed, "Oh, dearie me," and went back to bed. "Nobody," he whimpered, "could call me a fussy man. I only want a little bit of butter for my bread." The Queen said, "There, there," and went to the dairymaid. The dairymaid said, "There, there," and she went to the shed. The cow said, "There, there, I didn't really mean it. Here's milk for his porringer and butter for his bread." The Queen took the butter and brought it to his Majesty. The King said, "Butter, eh?" and bounced out of bed. "Nobody," he said, as he kissed her tenderly. "Nobody," he said, as he slid down the banisters. "Nobody, my darling, could call me a fussy man, but I do like a little bit of butter to my bread." Rice pudding. What is the matter with Mary Jane? She's crying with all her might and main, and she won't eat her dinner, rice pudding again. What is the matter with Mary Jane? What is the matter with Mary Jane? I've promised her dolls and a daisy chain, and a book about animals, all in vain. What is the matter with Mary Jane? What is the matter with Mary Jane? She's perfectly well, and she hasn't a pain. But look at her, now she's beginning again. What is the matter with Mary Jane? What is the matter with Mary Jane? I've promised her sweets and a ride in the train, and I've begged her to stop for a bit and explain. What is the matter with Mary Jane? What is the matter with Mary Jane? She's perfectly well, and she hasn't a pain, and it's lovely rice pudding for dinner again. What is the matter with Mary Jane? The Night the Ghost Got In by James Thurber. The ghost that got into our house on the night of November 17th, 1915, raised such a hullabaloo of misunderstanding that I am sorry I didn't just let it keep on walking and go to bed. Its advent caused my mother to throw a shoe through a window of the house next door, and ended up with my grandfather shooting a patrolman. I am sorry, therefore, as I have said, that I ever paid any attention to the footsteps. They began about 1:15 in the morning, a rhythmic, quick-cadenced walking around the dining room table. My mother was asleep in one room upstairs, my brother Herman in another. Grandfather was in the attic in the old walnut bed. I had just stepped out of the bathtub and was busily rubbing myself with a towel when I heard the steps. They were the steps of a man walking rapidly around the dining room table downstairs. The light from the bathroom shone down the back steps, which dropped directly into the dining room. I could see the faint shine of plates on the plate rail. I couldn't see the table. The steps kept going round and round the table. At regular intervals, a board creaked when it was trod upon. I supposed at first that it was my father or my brother Roy, who had gone to Indianapolis, but were expected home at any time. I suspected next that it was a burglar. It did not enter my mind until later that it was a ghost. After the walking had gone on for perhaps 3 minutes, I tiptoed to Herman's room. "Psst!" I hissed in the dark, shaking him. "Up!" he said, in the low, hopeless tone of a despondent beagle. He always suspected that something would get him in the night. I told him who I was. "There's something downstairs," I said. He got up and followed me to the head of the back staircase. We listened together. There was no sound. The steps had ceased. Herman looked at me in some alarm. I had only the bath towel around my waist. He wanted to go back to bed, but I gripped his arm. "There's something down there," I said. Instantly the steps began again, circled the dining room table like a man running, and started up the stairs toward us, heavily, 2 at a time. The light still shone palely down the stairs. We saw nothing coming. We only heard the steps. Herman rushed to his room and slammed the door. I slammed shut the door at the stairs top and held my knee against it. After a long minute, I slowly opened it again. There was nothing there. There was no sound. None of us ever heard the ghost again. The slamming of the doors had aroused Mother. She peered out of her room. "What on earth are you boys doing?" she demanded. Herman ventured out of his room. "Nothing," he said gruffly, but he was in color a light green. "What was all that running around downstairs?" said Mother. So she had heard it, too. We just looked at her. "Burglars!" she shouted, intuitively. I tried to quiet her by starting lightly downstairs. "Come on, Herman," I said. "I'll stay with Mother," he said. "She's all excited." I stepped back onto the landing. "Don't either of you go a step," said Mother. "We'll call the police." Since the phone was downstairs, I didn't see how we were going to call the police, nor did I want the police, but Mother made one of her quick, incomparable decisions. She flung up a window of her bedroom, which faced the bedroom windows of the house of a neighbor, picked up a shoe, and whammed it through a pane of glass across the narrow space that separated the 2 houses. Glass tinkled into the bedroom occupied by a retired engraver named Bodwell and his wife. Bodwell had been for some years in rather a bad way and was subject to mild attacks. Most everybody we knew or lived near had some kind of attacks. It was now about 2 o'clock of a moonless night. Clouds hung black and low. Bodwell was at the window in a minute, shouting, frothing a little, shaking his fist. "We'll sell the house and go back to Peoria," we could hear Mrs. Bodwell saying. It was some time before Mother got through to Bodwell. "Burglars!" she shouted. "Burglars in the house!" Herman and I hadn't dared to tell her that it was not burglars but ghosts, for she was even more afraid of ghosts than of burglars. Bodwell at first thought that she meant there were burglars in his house, but finally he quieted down and called the police for us over an extension phone by his bed. After he had disappeared from the window, Mother suddenly made as if to throw another shoe, not because there was further need of it, as she later explained, because the thrill of heaving a shoe through a window glass had enormously taken her fancy. I prevented her. The police were on hand in a commendably short time. A Ford sedan full of them, 2 on motorcycles, and a patrol wagon with about 8 in it, and a few reporters. They began banging at our front door. Flashlights shot streaks of gleam up and down the walls, across the yard, down the walk between our house and Bodwell's. "Open up!" cried a hoarse voice. "We're men from headquarters." I wanted to go down and let them in, since there they were, but Mother wouldn't hear of it. "You haven't a stitch on," she pointed out. "You'll catch your death." I wound the towel around me again. Finally, the cops put their shoulders to our big, heavy front door with its thick, beveled glass and broke it in. I could hear a rending of wood and a splash of glass on the floor of the hall. Their lights played all over the living room and crisscrossed nervously in the dining room. stabbed into hallways, shot up the front stairs, and finally up the back. They caught me standing in my towel at the top. A heavy policeman bounded up the steps. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I live here," I said. "Well, what's the matter? You hot?" he asked. I was, as a matter of fact, cold. I went to my room and pulled on some trousers. On my way out, a cop stuck a gun into my ribs. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I live here," I said. The officer in charge reported to Mother. "No sign of nobody, lady," he said. "Must have got away. What did he look like?" "There were 2 or 3 of them," Mother said, "whooping and carrying on and slamming doors." "Funny," said the cop. "All your windows and doors was locked on the inside, tight as a tick." Downstairs we could hear the tramping of the other police. Police were all over the place. Doors were yanked open, drawers were yanked open, windows were shot up and pulled down, furniture fell with dull thumps. A half-dozen policemen emerged out of the darkness of the front hallway upstairs. They began to ransack the floor, pulled beds away from walls, tore clothes off hooks in the closets, pulled suitcases and boxes off shelves. One of them found an old zither that Roy had won in a pool tournament. "Looky here, Joe," he said, strumming it with a big paw. The cop named Joe, took it, and turned it over. "What is it?" he asked me. "It's an old zither our guinea pig used to sleep on," I said. It was true that a pet guinea pig we once had would never sleep anywhere except on the zither, but I should never have said so. Joe and the other cop looked at me a long time. They put the zither back on a shelf. "No sign of nothing," said the cop who had first spoken to Mother. "This guy," he explained to the others, jerking a thumb at me, "was naked. The lady seems historical." They all nodded, but said nothing, just looked at me. In the small silence we all heard a creaking in the attic. Grandfather was turning over in bed. "What's that?" snapped Joe. 5 or 6 cops sprang for the attic door before I could intervene or explain. I realized that it would be bad if they burst in on Grandfather unannounced, or even announced. He was going through a phase in which he believed that General Meade's men, under steady hammering by Stonewall Jackson, were beginning to retreat and even desert. When I got to the attic, things were pretty confused. Grandfather had evidently jumped to the conclusion that the police were deserters from Meade's army trying to hide away in his attic. He bounded out of bed, wearing a long flannel nightgown over long woolen underwear, a nightcap, and a leather jacket around his chest. The cops must have realized at once that the indignant, white-haired old man belonged in the house, but they had no chance to say so. "Back, you cowardly dogs!" roared Grandfather. "Back to the lines, you goddamn lily-livered cattle!" With that he fetched the officer who found the zither a flat-handed smack alongside his head that sent him sprawling. The others beat a retreat, but not fast enough. Grandfather grabbed Zither's gun from its holster and let fly. The report seemed to crack the rafters. Smoke filled the attic. A cop cursed and shot his hand to his shoulder. Somehow we all got downstairs again and locked the door against the old gentleman. He fired once or twice more in the darkness and then went back to bed. "That was Grandfather," I explained to Joe, out of breath. "He thinks you're deserters." "I'll say he does," said Joe. The cops were reluctant to leave without getting their hands on somebody besides Grandfather. The night had been distinctly a defeat for them. Furthermore, they obviously didn't like the layout. Something looked, and I can see their viewpoint, phony. They began to poke into things again. A reporter, a thin-faced, wispy man, came up to me. I had put on one of my mother's blouses, not being able to find anything else. The reporter looked at me with mingled suspicion and interest. "Just what the hell is the lowdown here, bud?" he asked. I decided to be frank with him. "We had ghosts," I said. He gazed at me a long time, as if I were a slot machine into which he had, without result, dropped a nickel. Then he walked away. The cops followed him, the one grandfather shot holding his now bandaged arm, cursing and blaspheming. "I'm going to get my gun back from that old bird," said the zither cop. "Yeah," said Joe, "you and who else?" I told them I would bring it to the station house the next day. "What was the matter with that one policeman?" Mother asked after they had gone. "Grandfather shot him," I said. "What for?" she demanded. I told her he was a deserter. "Of all things," said Mother. "He was such a nice-looking young man." Grandfather was fresh as a daisy the next morning. We thought, at first, he had forgotten all about what had happened, but he hadn't. Over his third cup of coffee, he glared at Herman and me. "What was the idea of all them cops terry-hooting around the house last night?" he demanded. He had us there. An untitled piece by Florence King. They had titles in the magazine when first published, but this collection has neither titles nor an index. This is from July 19, 1993 by Florence King. It is typical of America that having invented efficiency apartments, singles bars, soup for one, and that cosmopolitan girl, we have dropped spinster from the language and consider old maid a sexist slur. I make a point of using both. If I fill out a form that asks for my marital status, I skip the printed selections, write in spinster, draw a block beside it, and check it. When an aluminum siding telephone salesman asked to speak to the man of the house, I said, "There isn't any, I'm an old maid," and derived enormous satisfaction from his audible gulp. Spinsterhood was powerful long before feminism hit the fan. Point to any area of sex discrimination, and you will find that old maids have always sailed through unscathed. Businessmen know all too well that the hand that rocks the cradle rocks the boat. Most married women with children are no use to anybody, unless the stock exchange is hiring amok runners, but spinsters give females a good name. We come to work on time, with no visions of babysitters and daycare centers dancing like rancid sugar plums in our heads. We can work overtime on a moment's notice, and there is never any spit-up on our paperwork. Credit ratings: an old maid and a divorcee with 3 children to support are both single, but the resemblance ends there. Instead of urging women to conceal their marital status under the muzzy blanket of Ms., feminists should have encouraged the inclusion of spinster on applications. It would have pulled up women's overall credit rating and eliminated the automatic discrimination against them caused by the bill-paying problems of liberated divorcees. Remember the classic old maid joke? Before going to bed, she spent an hour locking the doors and the windows of the house that she occupied alone. Sounds like a big house, doesn't it? She also hired lots of hired men, and when she begged them to marry her, she always reeled off a long list of her economic assets to sweeten the deal. The feminization of poverty was nowhere in evidence. Auto insurance? Old maids look at the road, not at what Jason did to Debbie's dress. As for life insurance, take a peek at the tombstones in Old Maid Gardens. Susan B. Anthony, 1821 to 1906. Anna Dickinson, 1842 to 1932. Elizabeth Blackwell, 1821 to 1910. Clara Barton, 1821 to 1912. Dorothea Dix, 1802 to 1886. Elizabeth Peabody, 1804-1894. A certain teacher and reformer, little known today, is the undisputed star of Old Maid Gardens. Here she is, that perennial, unplucked flower of reform politics, Emily Howland, 1827-1929. By God, that's what you call a good set of bowels. Have you ever noticed that there are no old maids in laxative commercials? They beam the message that women are 3 times more likely to suffer constipation, yet the sufferers portrayed are always matrons and their married daughters, who conclude that the problem comes from doing so much for others. An unconscious gem of truth in advertising, hinting that marriage and motherhood are the ties that bind. I wish my fellow conservatives would tone down their plangent testimonials to the great God family. I also wish that feminists would try to harden women, as real feminists should, by preaching renunciation instead of tearing them apart by simultaneously promoting masculine work and condemning masculine work habits. For example, Adrienne Rich. I want to make it clear that I am not saying that in order to write well or think well, it is necessary to become unavailable to others or to become a devouring ego. This has been the myth of the masculine artist and thinker, and I repeat, I do not accept it. Bowl, madam, bowl. If you really reject it, why not simply say so, and briefly, instead of dragging in defensive preambles and italics? The myth of the masculine artist and thinker, or any worker, is not myth but fact. Its real name is concentration, and it is achieved by making oneself unavailable to others. He travels fastest who travels alone, and that goes double for she. Mendacious pep talks, such as Miss Rich's, keep married women in a perpetual state of conflict and make them jealous of unencumbered women. The jealousy crops up in a phrase I hear regularly. If I could do what you do. Write the same goddamn page 20 times? Write all day Christmas? Get halfway through a book only to realize that you started too late in dramatic time and the whole thing is turning into a flashback? Anybody who chose that moment to ask, "When's dinner?" would get killed, ladies, and liberal Adrienne Rich knows it. She won't tell you. I just did. Of all the benefits of spinsterhood, the greatest is carte blanche. Once a woman is called that crazy old maid, she can get away with anything. Thank you for listening to the end.